Hey, everybody.
Hi. Wait, I'm not everybody, but hi.
Well, you're part of the subset that is everybody.
I'm somebody.
This week we have something special planned for you all. This is an episode that wouldn't have actually existed without the Tech Pod as it is, but specifically the Tech Pod Discord. We have a representative from the Pine64 group coming on the show to talk about their products and their open source stuff and all that. And it's we thought it'd be an interesting thing to have on both feeds. Honestly, it's on the FOSS Pod feed. It's on the Tech Pod feed. We apologize for the double dip this week. Yeah,
but you're traveling.
I'm dealing with some family stuff, and and I'm not. It was a good time to have a FOSS Pod episode. Also, Brad, you're in the middle of the launch of 1 million games, or maybe the launch of 8 games, as the case may be.
Yes.
So it's been a lot of talking for both of us this week.
Games and not E3 streams, like they would be E3 streams if E3 hadn't died. But
nope, there's no E3. Just streams. But yeah, we'll be back next week with a regular episode. And thank you all for listening. And stay tuned till the end of the show for the patron thank yous. I think one of my favorite categories of hardware is the thing that you hear about and you're like, wow, that sounds too good to be true, right?
Yeah. It's like the thing you would love to get on Christmas morning.
Yeah, but or like, hey, here's a CPU from Intel or AMD that you can overclock 50% over its stock clocks, yes. Or some sort of device that you're like, wow, that is not just incredible, it's better than anything I have, but also it's very, very inexpensive.
Yes, it's the deep bang for the buck category of product.
Exactly. And there's one of those that came up for us fairly recently in the Tech Pod Discord. It initially sounded like, and I actually say this in the interview, it sounded like an Internet of Shit thing, right? Like some unnecessarily connected device with firmware and all sorts of nonsense when you've had an analog thing that's been built for the same way since the 50s in your house already. And then I got it. Mm-hmm. And I was like, this is incredible. This is an incredible device. It's changed the way I do that kind of work. And it costs like $25. We're talking about the PineSill. Mm-hmm. In case you didn't know, it's an open source RISC-V powered soldering iron that is powered off of a USB-C plug, or you can use a barrel connector if you want. You can plug it into a lot of USB power supplies. It needs it has specific requirements, but they're still readily available. And it's easily the best soldering iron I've ever owned.
I followed the exact same trajectory you did. The first time you told me about it, I was like, why in God's name do we need our soldering irons to be smart now? And now that I bought one and used it, I totally get it. And now we are following that trail all the way back to the source and talking to the company that makes both that and a bunch of other products that also follow that same philosophy.
Welcome to the FOSS Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
This week's FOSS Pod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all of the value of open source to Google and all of the resources of Google to open source. Brad, I'm really excited to have this conversation because I didn't fully appreciate how broad the range of products that Pine64 creates. I didn't know about coming into this interview before we started doing the research. I didn't know anything about the origins of the company, what they've been doing, what they're looking forward in the future, what they do off as kind of weird side projects. It's kind of all side projects. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting company. It's an interesting application of open source. They are, I think, probably a more open hardware company than any of the other hardware folks we've talked to. And we're going to talk to Lukasz Erecinski, who's the senior advisor at the Pine64 project, about the whole thing right now. Before we get any further, can you kind of give us the rundown of the breadth of the offering and all the different places that Pine64 has their hands in?
Yes, and we never thought we'd be making a soldering iron. It was supposed to be a complete side project. But yes, so soldering iron, a smartwatch, amazing piece of kit, which we're really proud of. 2 smartphones, the PinePhone and PinePhone Pro. Currently a laptop, PineBook Pro. Tablets, which includes an e-paper reader, and which is available to the public per se, but if you're a developer, you can get a unit to develop on. 2 tablets, one of which is the first tablet with a RISC-V SoC in the world, at least to my knowledge, as well as a number of maker hardware, including quite specialized power supply units and accessories for the phone, such as the specialized back cases, which allow the phone's functionality to be expanded, as well as obviously a whole wide range of single board computers.
Sure. Like I was gonna say, there's single board computers for everything from like that are just standard single board computers that we all know and love, all the way up to things that like are IP cameras that are powered over Ethernet that you can jam into whatever case you want, and it's a fascinating range of projects. How did you get involved? How did you get started with the project? How did you get involved?
I started in 2015, right after the Kickstarter. So I wasn't a part of the Kickstarter campaign. I was brought in after the Kickstarter to sort of find the way forward for the project and figure out what we're doing next.
This was for the single board computer, the first single board computer?
Correct. So although the Pine64 Model A was commercially a significant success, from a marketing and community perspective, it didn't go particularly well. So at that time, there was a lot of sort of soul searching within the project, trying to figure out what's the next step, if there is a next step actually for a short period of time. And I was brought on board. The founder, TLM, he flew into London where I lived at a time. He met me for a pint and he said, so what do you think? Do you think we can build a community, run this thing and take it forward? And I said, yeah, I think it's doable. Nothing is lost at this point in time. We can totally give it a go. And we decided to pursue a number of other products.
How was that first board a failure? Just out of curiosity, from a community standpoint.
Right. So the first point of failure was that although TL is an excellent engineer and a very well-established sort of businessman, entrepreneur, he at the time had very little marketing capabilities of his own. So what they did, him and the co-founder, was they basically hired a marketing company to run the Kickstarter. And probably he wasn't even fully aware of where they're going to take this. And instead of the vision, which was always there, to build a piece of hardware and build a software community around it, bringing developers on board, what happened was that the advertisement went out as an end user finished product. So that brought in a sense, the wrong crowd initially of people who experienced this sort of a Raspberry Pi sort of experience out of the box, which certainly was not the case at the time.
And the idea of that first board was to build a 60. At the time, Raspberry Pis were only 32-bit ARM computers, and the idea was to build a 64-bit single board computer that was maybe more open or just more community driven at the time.
More community driven, aimed at a different. So the idea was to have it aimed at a different sort of demographic, to have it aimed at developers who would really work on the 64-bit architecture on ARM, which wasn't really that well established at the time.
And the idea is if there's hardware, then you can kickstart that community, and then you got a bunch of consumers in who just wanted to run Plex and emulators on their A64 boards, and were disappointed because it was a little raw still.
This is absolutely what happened in a nutshell. Okay. Yes. So soon after the Kickstarter, there was definitely a sense of, so what do we do now, right? Because the product is good, the board was good, the developers who received it were quite happy. The issue were all the other people who now had a negative experience because they couldn't do all the things that they expected to be able to do with it. And then they felt, lied to. So when I was brought in, I was there as a sort of liaison between the community, that being both the development community as well as regular end users, and the Pine Store, the company, to sort of figure out where we're going collectively from there on.
If we could step back to the period before the Kickstarter for just a minute. I know TL, I was surprised to find out TL was responsible for the Popcorn Hour, which is a name I haven't seen in a long time, but I'm curious if his experience with that product informed or kind of led to him veering in this direction, because I never owned one myself, but it was one of the first really big kind of phenomenons in the set top kind of media player space. Like the early Apple TV, Roku, that type of stuff. Like I remember like anecdotally just seeing people all over the place super passionate about their popcorn hours. And I'm curious, A, was there anything like open source and community oriented about the popcorn hour? And B, is that kind of what led to TL going in this direction?
Yeah, for sure it did. I mean, I don't know the story in its entirety. You would have to ask him about this, I suppose. But it's my understanding that what happened was that obviously when he was doing the popcorn hour video audio players at the time, there were a number of them which gathered a significant following, and among those who participated were Linux developers and open source developers. And they brought open software to these SoCs. I believe these were quite specialized Sigma SoCs used in these devices. And I know for a fact that TL saw that a product which exists, which is in a sense a finished product on launch, those were very much end user devices from the get-go. These were sort of a different, they were aimed at a different audience, at audiophiles specifically. He saw that a device can be made better or improved upon by having open source community members kind of work on it. And so in this way, the company opened up a little bit as well, because they saw, how this contribution is ultimately also profitable to them, which isn't completely obvious if you're running this sort of company. It may seem obvious to us now, especially from where I'm saying, but back then in Asia, this wasn't necessarily a very obvious decision and choice to make, right? So they went to Sigma, they said, how much of this information can we disclose? How much can we provide it to community members? And ultimately, this experience, this first encounter with open source and how it can make an existing product better and extend its lifetime has certainly given him a sort of an idea to explore the open source world further.
It's hard to remember now, but at that time, the other people that were building hardware that was based on Linux were actively working against the communities in a lot of cases, like the router manufacturers and those folks were just, they weren't breaking the rules of the license, but they definitely weren't making it easy to participate for end users, and that was I think the exciting thing to me about Popcorn Hour. The community first approach is something that we've talked to a bunch of projects at this time, and there's a handful of communities that actually work that operate that way. It's interesting. Like, does that go all the way down to like product decisions and what direction you're going to go next, or like where does the line between what you all want to do internally and what the community wants to do? How do you decide where that line is? I guess is the first place to start.
Excellent question. So this has shifted over the years. Right now, the project is very large. Initially, when we started and when I kind of got into the position of community manager and brought in people from established projects on board, as well as community developers, and kind of huddled them together and said, so what do you guys want to do next? And what we used to do was we built a piece of hardware, we sent it out to the developers, they gave direct feedback, they told us what they want. This came back to us. And then when we had something that would resemble an early prototype, we would share it with the community and hear the community's feedback, so like end users' feedback. And this worked for a time. In terms of scale, it becomes quite difficult when you have a lot of people who want to chip in and have their say. And then, when you ask people a question, you have to be sure that you want to hear the answer. So like, last thing which we did where we involved the entire community was the keyboard for the PinePhone and the PinePhone Pro. And that made us realize how difficult it is sometime now with the size of the project to open it up to discussion, especially something as subjective as a keyboard layout and all the things that people want to see in such a thing. It becomes quite overwhelming when you get so much feedback, and you have to figure out, right, now we ask, so now we are in this position where if we wouldn't ask, we could have gone and done something that we thought was right. But now that we ask, we have to incorporate some of this feedback and the best of it. So we felt obliged to do so, but this has ultimately delayed the keyboard project by, I don't remember, by nearly a year. But in principle, what we do right now internally is we come up with an idea of what we want to do. So let's say it's another phone or whatever it is that we want to do. So we have an idea for a phone, and then we look around and see what components are available to us at a reasonable price, and what we can be sure is going to be available to us 3 years down the road as well. And then we establish we make contact with the vendors and stuff like that. We have boots on the ground in Shenzhen, so we have people in Shenzhen. So it's, we like to have direct contact with the vendors to talk to them and have a proper understanding of how their supply chain looks like. So we figure out what we want to do, what we can base it upon. Only then do we bring in developers from within the closest circle to talk about it, right? We don't open everything up to the choice of even the closest community, because if you ask, especially the very techie people, what would you like to see in your next phone? You're gonna hear that they want really high-end stuff and all of these sort of things, but ultimately nobody's gonna buy it. So we make some of the business decision quite early about what makes sense for us to make, but then choice of cameras, choice of LCD panel, choice of modem even, and stuff like that. This is largely up to debate with the closest of the closest, and then we open it further and further and further, and then we kind of present it to the community broadly.
It's interesting because on the software projects that are more community driven, it's a feature choice, right? It's like, do we add support for this file format or something like that? For you all, your choices are so tied to what hardware is available and what fits into the stuff like thermal budgets and like it's incredibly. To me, it's the thing that makes this project so neat is that there's any community involvement at all in the hardware decisions and that side of it. And you're not just saying, hey, here's the hardware platform we built this time, which is essentially what Raspberry Pi does, right? They're like, hey, here's what we built. Let's see what you all can do with it, and then we'll figure out what you've done and integrate that stuff into the next rev.
Yeah, I want to read a quote real quick from your philosophy page. I mean, you've touched on this pretty directly already, but still, just to see it stated kind of dogmatically is just really unique for this kind of project. We usually announce what we're working on well ahead of the shipping date, many months before a device is released, so that you have plenty of time to request product features, suggest changes, ask for and make changes to documentation, etc., before the first iteration of the device rolls off the factory line. So I'm curious, is this the type of thing that you think maybe is only possible in recent years now that we're in this age of kind of rapid prototyping and like kind of affordable, smaller batch hardware manufacturing? I mean, is this the type of thing that it seems like would have been impossible like a decade ago?
Yes, certainly. I mean, for sure, this has a lot to do with it. The other thing, which we touched upon, TL, the founder of Pine64, a part of the reason why we are able to do this is because we have the abilities to turn around products very quickly in a prototype fashion in Shenzhen in China, ultimately, right? So we can have 3 or 4 or 5 prototypes or something built with very different components inside them. Now, these are outrageously expensive if you're building one of something. So, it's sometimes it's good to build, 3 or 4 different options of potential hardware, and especially if it's quite modular, then developers can basically just mail it between each other or FedEx it between each other and kind of take a look at the different versions and options which they have. Yeah? So yes, it has become possible probably in the past 5 years, but I don't think it is possible to, especially when you have something as complex as a phone. I don't think rapid prototyping helps much here. You have to have access to the actual vendors and people who know that there is a reason why you want to build 1 or 5 of something, right? Because they know that you're going to come back and have 100, 1,000, 10,000, or however many 100,000 units later. Yeah.
The relationships with the people that run the factories, it turns out, I guess, in order to get them to make one of them for you, they have to know you're going to come back and make it worth their time later.
Yes, because even if a prototype costs, say, a 10-fold or 20-fold of the finished product, ultimately you're taking up a lot of time also of their staff and engineers. So it's if you are not somebody who has a track record, especially these days after the pandemic, when a lot of companies, a lot of factories in China have gone out of business during the pandemic, right? They have established clients. Many of them are not super keen on taking on experimental hardware.
Well, yeah, new risk. It's a risk-averse business to start with, right? How many people work for Pine64? Like, how many people are involved with are part of the full-time business now?
There's a lot. In the United States, you have 3 people, including TL. Here in Europe, you have 2 people, one me being included. But then Malaysia is where there's R&D, and there's quite a few people working there. Hong Kong is where the main office is currently. There's quite a few people working there. That's where you have support, dispatch, and stuff like that. And then there's contractors in Shenzhen who, including like scouts and people who we have a long running relationship for, like contact with vendors and other distributors and stuff.
And those folks find distributors and factories and like logistics stuff for shipping finished project and stuff like that? Correct.
Yes, that's exactly it. So they are contracted, but many of them have been with us for many years.
Is there somebody in that decision chain who is like the go or no go? The somebody has to make the decision finally. We're not getting a consensus from the community or the internal teams. Are there hierarchies for we're the hardware side, we're the software side, and stuff like that?
Yes, there is a person who gets to say, yes, we're doing it, or no, we're not doing it, and that is definitely TL. Then there's people like myself and the current community, Marek Kraus, who get to have a significant say in whether something is going forward and pitch in ideas and review stuff as it's coming in and see if it makes any sense to continue with a particular project. But this is quite fluid. There have been a few instances, even within the recent year, where 2 or 3 trusted community developers basically overruled what we wanted to do internally with relationship to the hardware, something which required us to pay a significant amount of extra money for a feature, but ultimately that feature found itself into the product. And so yes, there is a cutoff point, which is TL saying we cannot do this; it's impossible to do this. But there's always a debate. Sometimes these debates get quite heated, and sometimes they leak into the public as well. And these are the sort of things that happen. Yeah.
Boot ROMs on phones and things like that.
Yes,
that's how you've arrived as an open project when drama is spilling out into blog posts as people take sides. Yeah.
Yes, for the record, Martin Bram and I met at FOSSDem this year, and we had a beer, and everything's fine. So to anyone listening, we're all good.
I was going to say, so for people who aren't super dialed into the scene on this particular, like, this was really low-key scene drama for Linux projects in our experience.
Very polite, extremely polite.
And the concern was about bootloaders and how it would apply to alternate operating systems on the Pine phone. I realize now, as we're talking about the Pine phone, we haven't actually talked about the kind of scope and scale of the product offering that Pine64 is doing yet.
Yeah, the range, the breadth of the product offering is kind of astonishing to me. I mean, like you said, the initial Kickstarter was for a small board computer. Mm-hmm. You've got products like, for example, your desktop powered USB power supply. Mm-hmm. I love the kind of, there's a bit of an industrial look to it. It's got a screen that literally tells you the voltage and amperage of all the USB ports on there. It looks like something that would have been on, like, my grandfather was a machinist, and it was like the kind of equipment he might use, But also now you've shifted toward, you've got a smartwatch, you've got earbuds on the way. More sort of like packaged consumer-oriented stuff that, I mean, obviously still open firmware, still hackable and stuff you can tinker with, but more everyday sort of carry around items. Was that shift toward things like earbuds and smartwatches, was that entirely organically driven by the community, or was that ever in the initial roadmap that, like, we're going to start with more open and then go to more consumer?
No, I'll be completely honest with you here. No, these weren't community suggested projects. These are things we know the community will be keen on, because it allows a lot of hacking, a lot of fun things to be. I mean, the Pine-Sol has become huge. For instance, the Pine Time has also become huge, and on a different scale, but also huge. The earbuds, I think, so the Pine Buds Pro, I think that they have a lot of potential, and we have seen a lot of interest in them. But ultimately, these are business decisions, because the project needs to make enough money to make things that do not make money. So, say the smartphones, they, for instance, do not generate a profit, right? They are there simply because we wanted to do a smartphone, right? Similarly with the laptops, with the ARM laptops, quite similarly with the tablets. So with the PineTab V and the PineTab 2. So there needs to be things within our range that do generate the funds to do the things that, that are more fun, and definitely there's no need to hide the fact that the Pine-Sol, the Pine Time, the Pine Buds, as well as some of the modules, are designed to generate that profit to do some of the fun things the other fun things we do. Yeah.
Yeah, with hardware especially, and especially with, since you're doing RISC-V hardware now, there's a chicken or egg situation where you have to build the hardware so that the software can exist, so that the hardware can sell. And I assume that's the point with the laptops and the tablets and the smartphones, is to build up these ecosystems for people using Linux for phones and so that these actually do become viable platforms at some point in the future. And I assume you don't always want them to be projects that are losing money. Eventually, I hope. I assume you want them to drive revenue for the company. But I
mean, there's definitely some products that do not need to make revenue, such as the phones, right?
Yeah.
We just want to see Linux on smartphones, and we want to see a future where there is an alternative to the current operating systems, right? And one way of doing that is making sure that everybody can get their hands on one if they want one. From the moment we conceived of this idea, we figured we'll pretty much sell it at costs, just to make sure that everybody who really wants one can get one, right? So they're not losing money, but they're not generating revenue. But something has to generate revenue, and there's definitely some products that are designed to generate revenue within the lineup.
It's remarkable to me that you talk about things like the Pine Time, the smartwatch, as being the sort of popular volume movers, the profit-generating products, because I was ready to come in here and say that your prices are just astonishingly low. I mean, the Pine Time currently on your site is selling for $26.99, and I looked at that and I was just like, there has to be a zero missing here. Like, how is this possible? I mean, even though you say that these are successful revenue drivers, I mean, I don't know how much you want to get into the business model, but I mean, these are, I assume, like relatively low profit margin. I mean, it seems remarkable what you're getting, looking at what else is out there, from more closed companies in the same space for this price.
Sure. But even if, let's say, they each generate, so even if the Pine-Sol and the Pine Time just generate a dollar or $1.50 in very large quantities, which these have had significant uptake, this is perfectly fine. And then compute modules, while Raspberry Pi compute module has been, the standard very much in the West, the Supine compute module has been taken up in significant parts of Asia, for a long time now, used in everything from rail signage to slot machines and what have you. And those sort of things make phones and tablets with RISC-V processors possible, yeah?
So what's the common thread for all this? Is it, hey, we can get electronics manufactured like we have? Is that the sauce of the company, or is it we're really good at SoCs, or what connects the Pine-Sol and the phone, or is it just, hey, this is a thing we want to exist in the world? What connects the Pine-Sol and the phone and the tablet and the laptop and the SoC and the power station?
Right. So there's definitely a maker side to this equation. Even things such as the phone can be dismantled. We actually, if you break it, we encourage you to fix it yourself. There's spare parts on the website and stuff like that.
I love that, by the way. It's my favorite thing.
It's a question of, undoing 12 screws or whatever. And you'll be fine. You'll have it. I'm not particularly technically savvy, but I've taken apart dozens of them and fixed many of them. They're really quite trivial to fix if you drop it. It's a question of 20 minutes for me to fix one. So no biggie. So, but there is also a lead thread which goes from when we create a single board computer. A single board computer is obviously a standalone device, but it is also a basis, a platform upon which we sometimes, not always, but usually decide to build more products, right? So there are particular SoCs which we see particularly high potential in, right? Usually from SoC vendors who are more friendly or more keen to cooperate with the open source community. There's definitely some of the products are created just because we want to see them exist. There are some products which exist because there is a need for them to exist in the business world. So this would be the compute modules, like Sopines were massively huge. There are products which exist simply because they didn't exist before and we didn't know if there was a market for them or not, such as Open Smartwatch. And it turns out that it is, I'll be honest, it's a phenomenal project, right? When we were talking first about the Pine64, nobody would understand why would anyone want to have a soldering iron that connects, via Bluetooth to your desktop to display how hot the tip is. But turns out that a lot of people want that, so you never know.
That specifically is a feature that my much more expensive soldering station from a company that's been making soldering irons for 100 years does not offer at anything other than like ridiculous professional level prices. So when I saw, it was literally the fastest time when I saw the Pine64 that I've ever gone from, oh God, another thing's USB connected or another thing's Bluetooth connected. Why do we need this? To, oh wow, I've hit the order button. It's going to be here in 3 days. That sounds fantastic. So it is a place where having smart control over your temperature actually makes a difference in how well you can solder. Also the size of the thing and the fact that I can run off a USB power pack. Mm-hmm. So I have a portable soldering iron that doesn't use butane and works anywhere. And I won't torch my boards when I'm doing stuff with it it is a transformative device for me. So I appreciate you all a lot. I guess what I'm saying is thank you for making the Internet of Shit soldering iron.
Yeah, but the Pine64 isn't the first soldering iron to run the open operating system or the open firmware for it. There have been others, except we reached out to Ben Ralem directly. We said, hey, we want to make one of those things. They seem like, they seem fun. Would you like to tell us what you want to see in one of these? And he came aboard and he told us exactly what he wanted to see in such a soldering iron. And we said, all right, well, we'll make it happen. And here we are. And this is why it's ultimately a better soldering iron than the alternatives, which were available at the time, is because he came in and he said, look, this is what people are looking in these little things. He worked, he really guided us through this and made a very good product. And then when we wanted to do the V2, we really spoke to him for months about it, not to make it into a gimmick, but make it into something that does what it already does better. Because ultimately, for those who care about 2 seconds or 3 seconds faster heat up time, the V2 does heat up ridiculously fast even compared to the V1. But then we thought, what else can we do that would open up the possibilities with the soldering iron? And Bluetooth was one of the options.
I mean, I almost feel like you're doing a public service here, because like with the Pine64, just like with the smartwatch, the thing is selling for $26 right now. And when Will told me, I had never heard of it before until Will got one and described it to me, and I was like, well, that easily is going to be $200 or $300 minimum. And I looked at it on the site and just fell out of my chair. It's like I solder something maybe once a year, but at that price range and with this level of features and openness, like why wouldn't I get one, right? Like it's just, I feel like it's in a category where just about anybody who's even like soldering curious could grab one at fairly low risk and give it a shot, right?
Yeah, and I mean, if you like RISC-V microcontrollers, it's running on a RISC-V microcontroller, and we even made a breakup board for it, which you can pick up if you want to, use it as a, just to learn about RISC-V as a platform.
I think it's the first RISC-V processor I had in the house. I'm reasonably sure of that.
Oh yeah,
so,
all right, yeah.
Is it fair to say the Pine64 is sort of the breakout product in terms of market penetration? And I know it rises up in Amazon search results a lot now. Is it kind of the most visible?
Right. In that sense, yes. Yes. Because obviously there's relatively few people in the world who want a Linux smartphone, right? Or in general, there's a few people who want a Linux laptop, and especially one which runs ARM. There's very few such people still. I mean, statistics don't lie. So yes, in terms of sheer volume, yes, absolutely. This is probably the product that has seen the most adoption throughout all sorts of circles, makers, but I've seen them everywhere, literally. But the Pine Time, there's a lot of people in conventions who you're gonna see wearing a Pine Time, and following the pandemic, this was the first FOSS, and when I went and just saw how many Pine phones there are in the community, it's completely nuts.
One of the cues that I had that the Pine64 has achieved pretty broad penetration is that it's the one product, or at least I assume at least the first one that has had a cloning problem, that there are counterfeit Pine64s out there now. I'm sure from a design and logistics standpoint, it was annoying to deal with that problem, but is it also a little flattering that you've made something popular and robust enough that people want to try to copy it?
Of course it is flattering. We estimate that anywhere between 10 to 20 times more, that there have been 10 to 20 times more copies sold than the original Pine64 V1. We've put in a security feature into the V2, which allows you to check whether you have a genuine device or not. But that's just for you. I mean, that's just whether you want to support us and the project, or but I'm sure they're going to be able to replicate it otherwise just fine as well in a month's time or 2 months' time.
So I was going to say, how you say you have these leader products that are generating revenue that support the rest of the of the Pine64 business, and I'm curious, is it that you look at a margin that you can sell the device for, and you're like, okay, we're going to put this percentage back? Is there funding from other sources that aren't selling hardware, or is everything funded off of selling hardware at this point?
Everything. We do not have so there are internally a few principles. One is that we do not have any, that the only stakeholders are community members and developers. So we do not have anyone else exerting any type of pressure on us. This is kind of, because we do want to do weird things, right? If I were to go, the Pine Time was my idea, right? Were I to go and pitch an open smartwatch, in a traditional setting, I would have been turned down. It just simply did not make sense at the time, right? So no, we do not have other means of revenue. I mean, it is all hardware. There's no other source of income.
I'm curious how open your hardware designs are. I mean, obviously that is a goal of the company, but I assume there are just certain legal restrictions in terms of the vendors you work with, and I don't know about schematics and documentation. Mm-hmm. Are there limits to how much you can expose to the developers in terms of IP and proprietary technology that the vendors that you work with just won't allow you to make open?
This will vary from one product to the other, but in general, because we work with developers so closely, what happens is that we will usually settle only for a component if we can get the schematic for it, right? So we will never buy something where we know that we have no contact with the vendor, we have no information about it, and no one is interested in working on it, right? So for instance, with the PinePhone Pro, we had a really lovely camera for the rear-facing camera, which, we could have gotten, we could have a steady supply of it, but there was no real work on it being done in Linux. Nobody really had any interest on working on it. We had no documentation for it, so we had to basically go and settle on something else, something which has all of this support and interest and work. So in general, with regard to openness, we make sure to get as much data as we can from the vendor. Where SDKs and stuff like that are pertinent, we always get it from the vendor and make sure that this is delivered to developers. Where there hasn't been any efforts made, so like LCD panels, bring up of these LCD panels in Linux, it's from the ground up. We have company representatives who basically say, yeah, we'll come in and we'll talk to the devs and we'll let the devs know, you're going in the right direction, that sort of thing. Then we have, with respect to the main SoC, we have very good contact with Rockchip and now with other vendors as well, who have, they have been good when it comes to the open source community. And then everything that is ours that we do, we document. And we make it available to the community. We stop at basically providing Gerber files, which is the kind of the stop point. And the reason for it is not so much because we don't want you making your own phone. It's that we know that where we manufacture and make things, we could see, if the Pine Sol can be cloned, so can the Pine phone with the right files and much faster.
Does doing development in public in the open make it harder to kill stuff as it's going when you see it's not going to work out? Do you get to the point that you've announced something and you're like, oh, we shouldn't be making this, and you've had to kill stuff as you're in progress?
Yes, absolutely. The IP cam, which we call the Cube, everybody on the team thought it's a great idea. Turns out nobody's interested in it. The SoC was great. The actual camera module was good. The design, I thought, was pretty solid. You could run any type of, Linux on it and just stream from it. Or there's, I'm blanking on it right now, but there's one dedicated Linux distribution, or basically it's what is it called? Motion Eye? Is that what it's called? Which is made for basically like security cameras and stuff that could run on it. And it seemed like a great idea. You have an open nanny cam or security cam. It seemed like a great idea, but ultimately the interest was not there. So we did kill it off. There's very few projects that we killed off because there was no interest, however. There were a few which we had to kill off, especially during the pandemic, because there was no means to manufacture them. But otherwise, I think that the Cube is probably the only example that comes into my head of something which we killed off because there was no interest in it.
Okay, so it is listed as out of stock on your site, so it is literally out of production, just done.
It is out of production, yeah.
Okay.
I'll just say that we haven't really lost interest in the concept and definitely want to explore it more, but perhaps in a more modular fashion. So we made this tiny little microcontroller SBC called the AUX64, which is Linux capable. And we're developing sort of a camera module which will attach to it. So you would be able to sort of transform it into a sort of a Cube's spiritual successor for those few who were interested in the device.
I wanted to dig into just a little bit what it's like using the Pine phone, because, you know, of all your products, obviously a phone is the most universal. You know, not everybody uses a laptop or a smartwatch, but everybody's got a phone. So I'm just I'm curious, especially for people who aren't Linux developers, who are less tinkering inclined, what the out-of-the-box experience is like with Linux on a phone. You've standardized around Manjaro at this point on your phones, although I assume the other open phone OSs are still an option to install.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm just kind of curious, like when you boot it up for the first time, in terms of, I guess, just onboarding, you know, App Store, like what are the sort of common phone analogs like on there in terms of usability compared to the closed, bigger, you know, Apples and Googles of the world?
I'll tell you this. It depends on how you look at it. So it is the most successful Linux on mobile effort thus far. And the development over the past 2 years has just gone, you know, a very long way, right? Like we are at a point where all key features of the original Pine phone, as well as the Pine phone Pro, although to a slightly lesser degree, are functional on the device. And from a purely hardware perspective, these are some of the most open devices, period. Like even down to the modem. You can flash the modem with, where permissible, you can flash the modem on your own with open firmware. How is the experience compared to, say, Android or iOS? I think that this is nowhere close to something you would want to give somebody who's highly dependent on either these platforms and has never had any contact with Linux. Those people who think that we should be targeting the general population and general public, I do not agree with this point of view. Depending on which numbers you believe, there's anywhere between 20 to 60 million active Linux users in the world, and there are nowhere close to 20 to 60 million Pine phones out there. There's at best there's a few 100,000 Pine phones out there, and I think that this is a very big market in and of its own. So once we convince potentially those people who already use Linux on their desktop computers to have a phone with Linux, we can go after people who rely on Android or iOS in their daily life. How does it compare? It doesn't really compare particularly well, is the answer. I mean, you can browse, you can set up an email client, you can make and receive calls, you can take photographs, you can do some chats, which have ARM clients for Linux. But I mean, it will not do your banking app or your travel card or whatever it is that people do on a daily basis with their Android or iOS phones. You can install Spotify on it for those who care. So, but I mean, it is a different experience altogether. It does feel like a early proof of concept, regardless of which operating system you settle on. And some of these operating systems are much more polished. Some of these operating systems are mobile operating systems which happen to be Linux. And some of these operating systems are Linux which happen to run on mobile, right? So there are fractions and communities within the broader community as well, who require different things or want to see different things on the Pine phone, on the Pine phone Pro.
I've been tempted to pick one up, honestly, just to noodle with and see what, just to get the experience, see where it's at. Because the last time I looked at a Linux phone was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and they were early prototypes of things that people weren't maybe even showing publicly, and it was rough to unusable at that point. Mm-hmm. So there's a curve that we've seen with a lot of open source projects where development starts slow, and then there reaches a point where it's the typical capitalist hockey puck graph, right? Where all of a sudden the features are coming, the number of developers increases and the features go up and up. Do you feel like you're reaching? Are you working toward that point, or do you think do you see that point in the future for the Pine phone, or is that you think further off than we should be thinking about right now?
That is a super difficult question. I think that our core community wants different things from the phone than, say, my wife or my mom, right? And that is a bit of a problem, because the convenience that an Android phone, which is synced up to Google Cloud and all that stuff, gives you, it is by design is not replicable in the Pine phone. Yeah. By the design, by the philosophy of it. So I don't know how to answer this one. I mean, what I'll say is this. I hope that this iteration of the Pine phone, or the next iteration, or the next after that, or somebody else, some other company or person who has now a Pine phone gets inspired by it and creates something that will make everyone in the Linux community, in the open source community, say, I want one of these things. Like, I genuinely want one. And that it will meet their needs and requirements for it. So whether we make it or somebody else make it, to me personally, it doesn't really matter, as long as it gets made, right? And everybody wants to really work on it.
And there's also something to be said for just, especially in a world where people are becoming more, Cory Doctorow has been yelling about privacy for 25 years at this point. But I think there's more momentum from normal users, even non-Linux users, about the ownership of their own data and living outside of those closed ecosystems. So, I mean, maybe there will be momentum there in the future, and people are willing to make a few sacrifices to get something that's off of the Google grid or the Apple, off of Apple's ecosystem. So, fingers crossed, I guess. Do you all do user research? Like, do you do focused user research, or is it more informal? Like, how do you decide how do you decide which direction to go with products? How do you decide which products to support? How do you know that a product you're building for a market you're personally familiar with is going to work in Southeast Asia or North America or Africa or wherever else you care to sell stuff?
Well, we don't, because we do not really collect any information or data. I mean, we ran a poll about a year ago asking people, how do you find your phone? Like, what do you run on it? How do you use it? Is it your daily driver? Is it your spare phone? Or is it, are you disappointed with it? And is it in your drawer and you haven't picked it up for a year? I mean, we ask all sorts of questions, and this is a poll from at least a year ago. I can't remember when I put it out. And I think, I don't know, maybe like 4,000 or 5,000 people answered or something like that. Obviously, the number of existing users is much, much greater. So a lot of this we get via a sort of almost like an osmosis by just being a part of the community and talking to people on a daily basis, just like regularly in the chat, and just saying, seeing what it is that people talk about, what it is that they're excited about, what is it that they want to see, what is it that they're disappointed with. I mean, ultimately, we don't need to run these things because we're very much a part of the community. Like I check the chat every single day, and everybody who wants to, chat with me, they can chat with me. But we don't have any like focus groups and stuff like that.
I'm sure you can only say so much about prospective product ideas, things that may or may not happen, but are there any sort of pie in the sky goals or ideas that the team has had for product categories or spaces you'd like to get into that you either haven't yet or like would be very difficult to do?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are a few. So we definitely are looking at the next Pine Time, and we're working extremely closely with the developing community around that project Infinity Time that runs on the Pine Time, and they definitely have some awesome ideas. And this is, just to be clear to anyone listening, this is quite far out for us. It's still, months away from prototyping, but we're ping-ponging ideas. And in general, we are super interested in RISC-V as an architecture and where that can, take us in the next years. And I've spoken about this pretty openly, that we definitely, many of the devices that you see us do, which we have already made and which we have spoken about being interested in making, which are ARM-based, we definitely will be making some of them with RISC-V processors in the future as well. So this is basically no secret. So it's just a question of which makes sense. A RISC-V watch is a really fun thing, I think, and something that I would be very keen on seeing happen in the next 18 months or so. But, a RISC-V laptop sounds equally fun. I mean, but there are many, many different options here.
RISC-V is kind of the last big topic I wanted to ask you about. I'm curious if you can speak from a kind of business and contractual standpoint about what it's like working with it. I mean, for people who don't know, RISC-V is it's an open source architecture, kind of comparable to ARM in the mobile space in terms of capabilities, but open source and royalty-free, license-free. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate way to put it?
Yes. So this is accurate for the cores.
Okay.
So RISC-V has a lot of benefits to it, and it's super exciting for developers because they, the instruction set, the ISA for RISC-V is basically available on GitHub, and they can contribute to it. And you have a chance to help evolve the platform on a very, very raw metal level. So that's super interesting. From a manufacturer's perspective, RISC-V has the benefit, has multiple benefits. One is that with time, due to many more producers creating RISC-V SoCs, there's going to be more competition. And because RISC-V does not depend on a license, which you have to pay per design, these will provide more power at a lower cost to end users, right? Now, there's a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this as well, of saying that, oh, RISC-V is so early and it's going to be, it's coming up slowly and stuff. But if you compare how fast RISC-V is coming up, or Linux is coming up on RISC-V compared to early days of ARM, I mean, this is day and night. I mean, we can already run Linux in a very hacky and poor and unpleasant way on RISC-V today, with basically people have been so excited about it that even before there were broadly available single board computers and development platforms with RISC-V, we already had Linux on. I think that what we saw with Raspberry Pi and ARM in Linux happen in, what was it, 2012?
2012, yeah.
Yeah. We're going to see RISC-V really explode in the next 5 years. And I think Linux is going to be an extremely well-supported operating system on the platform. And I don't necessarily want to get into the politics of things, but if you account for what Chinese companies can and cannot manufacture at this point in time, I think we're going to see a lot of very powerful RISC-V chips coming out of China at very reasonable prices within 24 months, giving ARM architecture a real run for its money.
I'm a pretty active Debian user, and from what I've looked at, like the number of Debian packages being built for RISC-V is like over 90%, I believe, at this point. I mean, the penetration, the adoption has been kind of alarming to see how rapidly it's played out. Do you have a sense from like you've said, obviously ARM is much more mature, it's been around longer, the SoCs are more robust and capable, but do you have a sense of how fast RISC-V SoCs, at least the ones you're using, are approaching those capabilities in terms of like raw compute and GPU and stuff like that? Is it getting competitive yet?
No, but it will get there very, very fast. And I mean fast as in by the end of this year. But now, I also do not necessarily want to get too technical, because I would be speaking out of turn because I am not the right person to speak about it. But there is a misconception within the community about RISC-V as well. I mean, RISC-V shares many of the hurdles that we had with ARM and still have with ARM. Just because the cores are open doesn't mean that everything around these cores is open, and it's not.
Right, the SoC manufacturers can still chuck a GPU on the SoC that you have no access to internals on, right?
Yeah, I think that's like on Raspberry Pis and so forth. Like Broadcom will put something in the SoC that is completely closed and undocumented, right, and proprietary.
And then you have to rely on the goodwill of said GPU. I mean, you mentioned GPU, but it could be any other things that go into these SoCs, memory controllers, what have you. Then you have to rely on the goodwill of these companies that they want to cooperate with you. And to be fair, I'm not going to mention any names, but there are companies that have had a terrible track record. But now that they found themselves on RISC-V platforms and they're feeling the pressure, they are more or less reluctantly going ahead and open sourcing their drivers just by the pressure, right? This is what happens. I mean, when we go back to ARM and look at why is the RK3399 so well supported in Linux. So that's what you have in the Pinebook Pro and the PinePhone Pro. The reason is because Google built a Chromebook based on it a couple of years ago, and Google came in and he said open source, and Rockchip did, because there was pressure, right? And this is a different type of pressure. But now that there is RISC-V adoption and RISC-V adoption from end users and enthusiasts who apply pressure to particular companies, these companies see this. They also maybe see some benefit in it, in open sourcing. Now that there's a much bigger uptake, and it's not just business who uptakes these SoCs. So they're starting to open source as well. I mean, I don't want to jump the gun on RISC-V, but I do see a huge potential in RISC-V in the next 5 years.
I would love to hear, Lukasz, where can people find out more about Pine64 and find out more about you?
So about Pine64, we have a site for the organization. So that's pine64.org. There's a blog which I and others contribute to, writing monthly news at the end of each month. And then we're on Twitter, on Mastodon, and on Telegram, where we sort of stream news and information on the fairly regular.
Thank you, Lukasz, for coming on the podcast. We'd love to have you here and love to learn more about Pine64.
Yes, getting to hear, getting to talk to somebody who's got experience in this kind of like murky, nebulous world of how electronics get made these days is always super illuminating, because like, we're pretty awash in inexpensive electronics these days. And I think most people sort of just, their relationship is just sort of, I ordered online and it shows up at my house and that's it. So hearing from, the prototype phase through manufacturing, and especially with the community relationship model that Pine64 has, like it's just a fascinating look behind the curtain and how a lot of the stuff gets made.
I often say that open source hardware feels like the kind of good early cyberpunk novels where it's like some guy in a back room that has a bunch of circuits is hacking stuff together.
Yes.
This is what this really feels like. This feels like that in a not dystopian way, if that makes sense. I know cyberpunk's
100%
inherently dystopian, whatever, yada yada.
I don't know if I made this comparison in that interview. I may have, but like any product that feels like it would be the favorite brand of the Henry Rollins character from Johnny Mnemonic, like the cyberpunk mechanic guy, is probably pretty cool.
Yeah, and there's also a repairability aspect to the whole thing that I really, really like. So please make sure you check out Pine64. As we said in the interview, they love to get contributors, whether it's people writing documentation, people requesting stuff for new hardware. It was a fascinating interview, and thanks again to Lukasz for coming by. And that will do it for this week's episode of the show. As always, the FOSS Pod is brought to you by Google Open Source. They bring all the value of open source to Google and all the resources of Google to open source. Matt Purdy produced this episode, and Sabrina Hill edited. Thanks you all for listening. We'll be back soon with another episode of the FOSS Pod. Brad, we've reached the point of the show where we thank our patrons.
We have. Thank you, patrons.
Thank you, patrons. As always, if you would like to support the Tech Pod, you can go to patreon.com/techpod. Again, it's patreon.com/techpod. And for $5 a month, you get access to the fabulous Tech Pod Discord, which literally inspired the show. People were talking about this Pine-Sol months and months and months ago on the Tech Pod Discord. And I was like, I am incredibly skeptical, as I said in the intro, incredibly skeptical of this smart solder. Why does a soldering iron need to be smart? I have one with a dial on it that lets me set the temperature. That's all I need. I was wrong. I was very wrong.
Yep.
But yeah, we thank you all for your support every month.
Yes. Thank you to Discord, incredible resource. Not only did they turn us on to the Pine-Sol when I got mine and I couldn't get it to update on my PC for some unknown USB compatibility reason, and I had to go to my laptop and compile a version of the flashing utility.
Wow.
To get it to work. I wouldn't have been able to get that done either without the help of people on the Discord. just an endless resource.
As always, every week, we like to thank our executive producer tier patrons, including Nick Johnston, Paddle Creek Games makers of Fractured Veil, Andrew Slosky, the Bunny Demon.
Yeah.
Just Wedge, Joel Krauska, Twinkie 2049, David Allen, and James Kamek. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
And we will be back next week again with a regular episode. If I have time to do some reading while I'm gone, we might be able to start the Bluetooth triptych.
Oh.
I know. Maybe. Just put it out there as a possibility.
Dabbling with forces we may not understand, man.
Look, I'm just saying there are Finnish, Danish pirates out there, and we're going to find out what color their teeth are. And we're going to start with the Danish pirate. We're going to go through the entire history of the Danish piracy, and then eventually we'll get to Ericsson and Sony making a super team to invent radios on the phones. See y'all next week. Bye, everybody.